The vast steppes of Mongolia stretched endlessly beneath the sky, an ocean of grass where the wind carried whispers of both freedom and peril. It was the year 1178, and a young warrior named Temujin had just taken Borte as his wife. She was not only his companion but his anchor, the embodiment of his hopes for a life that promised stability after years of hunger, betrayal, and wandering. Their union was celebrated simply but joyfully, a rare moment of warmth in a land where survival was often measured in blood. Yet fate, cruel and merciless, had already chosen a different path for them. One night, before the campfires had fully burned out, the thunder of hooves shattered the stillness of the steppe. The Merkits, ruthless raiders and sworn enemies, descended upon Temujin's encampment like a storm. The chaos was immediate. Tents torn apart, warriors overwhelmed, women and children screaming into the night. Temujin, still a minor chieftain, faced an agonizing decision in the blur of violence. He could stand and fight, risking certain death against overwhelming odds, or retreat to live and one day exact revenge. His heart tore as he watched the Merkits drag Borte away, her cries piercing the night sky. In that moment, survival demanded cowardice. He fled, carrying with him not only shame but a burning vow. For 9 long months, Borte remained in captivity. She was passed as spoils, a living trophy subjected to violation and humiliation, her body claimed by another man. Each day in her prison of flesh and sorrow etched wounds deeper than any blade could cut. When Temujin finally rallied enough allies to strike back, storming into Merkit lands and rescuing her, the joy of reunion was clouded by a terrible truth. Borte was with child. The life growing inside her was not his. The realization struck Temujin harder than any enemy's sword. Here was the woman he had vowed to protect, returned to him but carrying the seed of another. The shame was unbearable, the bitterness unrelenting. In that cruel arithmetic of fate, Temujin understood something he would never forget. Weakness invites ruin. The man who once might have shown mercy was reborn in fire and vengeance. From that day forward, Temujin's heart hardened into iron. No longer would he allow compassion to guide his decisions. Where he once might have spared an enemy, now he demanded annihilation. The memory of Borte's suffering became a wound that never healed, a wound that reshaped not only his destiny but the destiny of entire nations. The boy who lost his wife became the man who swore to control the fates of thousands. And in that transformation, the seeds of an empire, one forged in blood, iron, and conquest, were sown. The shame Temujin carried after Borte's captivity never left him. It was more than a personal wound. It was a scar that reshaped how he saw power, loyalty, and conquest. To him, weakness had led to his humiliation, and he swore that never again would his survival, or the fate of his people, hinge on mercy. As Temujin rose from outcast to commander, he began to turn that shame into policy. What had once been a random horror of war, the seizing of women, was no longer left to chance or impulse. Under his growing rule, it became systematized. Sexual conquest was transformed into a tool of empire, woven into the laws and structures of the Mongol army. Scribes were ordered to keep meticulous records, writing not only the number of horses and arrows seized after battle, but also the women. They recorded their ages, their beauty, their health. Each woman was categorized, graded, and assigned. Just as livestock was divided among clans, women became part of a calculated distribution. Rank determined privilege. Generals and trusted officers received the finest captives, young women, often from noble families, chosen to serve as wives or concubines. Senior soldiers received others, while the rank and file were allotted their share from what remained. This was not chaos. It was inventory. Every detail, from the numbers taken to the names of those assigned, was documented as carefully as military supplies. To Temujin, this order was power. Where other tribes allowed the spoils of war to cause internal rivalries, Temujin created a structure that bound his men closer to him. Soldiers were rewarded not just with gold or plunder, but with the promise of flesh, guaranteed and organized by their Khan. Desire became discipline, but it was more than logistics. It was vengeance disguised as law. What he could not prevent with Borte, he would now control on a scale the world had never seen. If one woman had been stolen from him, he would ensure thousands were stolen for him. For the women, there was no mercy in this order. To be listed in those ledgers was to lose your name, your freedom, your future. Some became tokens of honor for Mongol leaders. Others were reduced to property parceled out like rations. Their tears and resistance meant nothing against the ink of a scribe's pen. This was the beginning of a darker empire. An empire where conquest was not just measured in land and blood, but in wombs. Where Temujin's personal shame hardened into imperial policy, and the fate of millions would be decided not on the battlefield, but in the silent cruelty of ledgers. With each new conquest, the Mongol war machine became more efficient, not only in how it toppled cities, but in how it absorbed their women. After the dust of battle settled and the cries of the dying faded, specialized units moved in. Their task was not to fight, but to collect. Women were rounded up, separated from their families, and herded into temporary enclosures. Children were torn from their mothers, too young to remember their heritage, destined to be raised as Mongols. The process was chilling in its precision. Medical officers inspected captives for disease or injury, while scribes recorded numbers and classifications. Women were stripped of their identities and reduced to categories. Grade A, the most beautiful, often virgins, destined for the Khan himself and his highest generals. Grade B, still young and desirable, assigned to senior officers. Grade C and D, older, less favored, distributed among common soldiers or relegated to camp labor. These women were not simply prizes of war. They became infrastructure, as vital to the army as weapons or horses. Just as the Mongols built supply chains for food and arrows, they built a system for managing human lives. Grade A women were treated like treasures, yet their lives were anything but enviable. Many came from noble families and were forced into marriages that erased their pasts. Grade B women often became concubines, while Grade C and D were tasked with endless drudgery, cooking, sewing, cleaning, and serving the very men who had destroyed their worlds. Some were forced to sing songs from their homelands for the entertainment of their captors, turning their culture into a cruel parody. Guards patrolled the enclosures day and night, preventing escape. Attempts at resistance were met with brutal punishment, meant to break the spirit of all who watched. Over time, a grim order emerged within the camps. Senior women, often from aristocratic backgrounds, were placed in charge of managing the households of Mongol officers, overseeing dozens of younger captives. Even here, hierarchy and bureaucracy thrived. It was a system designed not only to exploit but to erase. By making women participate in their own subjugation, cooking for their rapists, raising their children, managing their camps, the Mongols turned survival into complicity. For the empire, the benefits were clear. Soldiers were rewarded, morale was maintained, and discipline was reinforced through regulated desire. For the women, however, it was a living nightmare where even the smallest fragments of dignity were stripped away. What had begun as a personal wound in Temujin's life was now a machinery of brutality, grinding forward with every conquest. It was no longer just conquest of land, but conquest of bodies, woven into the very fabric of Mongol power. The Mongols did not simply conquer, they annihilated. When Temujin turned his gaze toward the Tatars, vengeance became extermination. His orders were chilling in their simplicity. Every male taller than the axle of a wagon wheel is to be killed. It was a measurement as crude as it was merciless. Boys barely 5 years old, still clutching wooden toys or holding their mother's hands, were slaughtered alongside grown men. The Tatars, once proud rivals of the steppe, were reduced to silence in a single command. The women and girls who survived this massacre were not spared. Torn from their families, they were handed over to Mongol soldiers and commanders as breeding stock. The Tatars' future, once carried in the bodies of their sons, was now forced into the wombs of their daughters. Entire bloodlines vanished, replaced by generations of children raised not as Tatars, but as Mongols. It was not simply war, it was cultural erasure. The Tangut kingdom, too, tasted this cruelty, though in a different and darker form. Here, the Mongols chose not to kill all the men, but to humiliate them beyond repair. Thousands were castrated, stripped not only of their strength but of their very manhood. These broken survivors were then forced to watch as their wives and daughters were violated in front of their eyes. The cruelty was deliberate, a weapon aimed at the soul rather than the body. To kill a man was one thing, but to make him live powerless while his bloodline was destroyed before him was another. In these acts, the Mongols proved that conquest could go beyond battlefield slaughter. It was not only about seizing land or plunder, it was about obliterating memory itself. Every culture, every tradition carried forward through fathers teaching sons, through families preserving rituals, through communities retelling stories, was severed. When the men were slain or broken, and the women were absorbed into Mongol households, the past dissolved. The Tatars and Tanguts would no longer exist as distinct peoples. They would be remembered only as footnotes beneath Mongol domination. Witnesses spoke of villages where the silence of men was absolute, where only the weeping of women remained. The air itself seemed to carry despair, as if the earth had drunk too much blood to bear life again. The Mongols had discovered a weapon more devastating than fire or steel: the systematic destruction of identity. This was more than killing a people. It was killing their tomorrow. It was the execution of memory, the murder of culture, the deliberate suffocation of hope. And in that void, only the Mongol name remained. What began as improvised cruelty soon evolved into something far more organized, far more terrifying. The Mongol Empire built not only roads, postal systems, and armies, but also structures designed to enforce sexual slavery with the same precision as tax collection or military campaigns. These were no ordinary camps. They were vast military brothels, fortified compounds that housed thousands of women, each one reduced to a living instrument of control. The architecture itself told the story. Corridors were deliberately narrow, preventing large groups from escaping or revolting. Windows were kept small, allowing no chance of flight. Centralized kitchens were built not only to ration food but also to ensure control, where meals could be laced with drugs to keep the captives subdued. Every detail was planned not for comfort but for efficiency, turning the human body into another cog in the machinery of empire. What made the system even more chilling was who administered it. The Mongols did not waste their own energy managing these prisons. Instead, they forced scholars, merchants, and bureaucrats from conquered lands, Chinese, Persian, and Arab alike, to run them. Men whose knowledge once served to build cities, trade networks, or systems of law now found themselves calculating rations for women, maintaining ledgers of inventory, and enforcing schedules of exploitation. Intellectual brilliance was enslaved to maintain barbarity. The scale was staggering. Some of the largest facilities held thousands of women, arranged in ranks and categories just as soldiers were organized in the field. The Mongols called it discipline. Survivors would remember it as a nightmare of endless corridors, barred doors, and torchlight that never dimmed. Guards patrolled with ruthless precision, trained not in war but in suppression of human spirit. These brothels became more than a punishment for conquered peoples. They became a reward system for Mongol warriors, a grim incentive to bind loyalty. A soldier could be certain of his share, just as he could be certain of his portion of grain or his horse. Desire was managed like rations, recorded and distributed with bureaucratic clarity. For the women, the system offered no escape. Even their daily tasks reinforced subjugation. They cooked meals for the men who violated them, sewed garments for their captors, and sang for their amusement. Some were forced to train new captives in duties, turning survival into complicity. Every act stripped away identity, reducing them to roles defined only by the needs of the empire. At its height, this machinery of sexual slavery was as institutionalized as Mongol taxation or law. It was empire reduced to its cruelest essence, order built upon domination, infrastructure fueled by human despair. What had begun as Temujin's personal wound had metastasized into an industry of horror, the darkest legacy of a conqueror who turned shame into a system. The shadow of the Mongol Empire stretched far beyond the battlefield. Even in lands the Mongols had not yet reached, fear itself became a weapon, reshaping entire cultures. Families, desperate to protect their daughters, began to alter traditions that had stood for centuries. Beauty, once a blessing, became a curse. In China, the practice of foot binding, a cruel custom already known among the wealthy, spread with new intensity. Parents believed that a girl whose feet were crippled and reshaped into tiny, twisted forms would be harder to abduct. The reasoning was grim. If she could not run, perhaps she would not be chosen. What had once been a symbol of refinement now became a shield against Mongol raiders. In torchlit chambers, mothers wept as they bound the feet of their daughters tighter, not for elegance, but for survival. In the Islamic world, fear took another form. Families scarred the faces of their daughters, deliberately marking their beauty in the hope that Mongol soldiers would pass them by. A cut across the cheek, a burn upon the skin, acts of violence performed by those who loved them most. Parents prayed that by destroying what was precious, they might save what was essential, life itself. Others resorted to harsher measures. Some fathers buried newborn daughters in the earth, believing death to be kinder than captivity. Others forced marriages while their daughters were still children, hoping that the status of being a wife might grant protection, however fragile, in the eyes of their conquerors. Childhood was stolen, replaced with vows uttered too soon, driven by terror rather than love. Everywhere the Mongol shadow fell, societies bent under its weight. Beauty was hidden, innocence sacrificed, traditions rewritten. Families that once celebrated the birth of daughters now mourned them as burdens. In villages across Central Asia, mothers whispered warnings as they brushed their daughters' hair. Do not look too fair. Do not stand too tall. Do not draw the eye. What made the fear more devastating was its persistence. Even after the Mongol armies moved on, the practices remained. Generations later, the scars endured, in bound feet, in disfigured faces, in childhood marriages normalized by desperation. The Mongols had not only conquered cities and kingdoms, they had conquered the way people thought about their own children, their families, and their future. It was a conquest of the imagination, a tyranny that lived in every scar, every grave, every whispered prayer. And in that tyranny, beauty itself was transformed into a dangerous inheritance. What had once been a mother's pride became her deepest dread. The world itself seemed to agree on one truth. Under the shadow of the Mongols, to be beautiful was to be doomed. Centuries have passed since the thundering hooves of Mongol cavalry shook the earth. Yet their legacy lives on in ways far deeper than ruins or stories. It is written into human bodies themselves, inscribed in DNA that cannot lie. Today, an estimated 16 million men carry a Y chromosome traceable directly to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. That amounts to nearly 0.5% of the world's male population, and nearly 8% of men across Asia. This staggering figure is not folklore. It is science. Geneticists, mapping lineages across Central Asia, discovered an overwhelming pattern. Vast populations connected to a single male ancestor who lived around the time of the Mongol Empire. The conclusion was inescapable. This was the biological footprint of a systematic campaign of sexual domination, one of the most sweeping in human history. Unlike myth or legend, the Y chromosome leaves no room for embellishment. Every generation multiplied the legacy, carrying forward a reminder of brutality turned into inheritance. Sons begot sons, who begot sons, and so on, until entire regions bore the mark of one conqueror's shame transformed into power. What had begun as Temujin's personal wound, born from his inability to protect his own wife, metastasized into genetic imperialism on a scale never before seen. For those who study it, the numbers are chilling. 16 million direct male descendants suggest far more when daughters and indirect lines are considered. Hundreds of millions of people alive today may unknowingly carry traces of this history in their blood. Each family reunion, each genealogy chart, each DNA test can potentially uncover a connection to a man whose empire was built not only on military genius but on the weaponization of the womb. The paradox is cruel. For countless descendants, their very existence is proof of survival. Their ancestors endured, bore children, and carried on despite the unendurable. Yet at the same time, Their lineage is testimony to violence, to acts committed not out of love but out of conquest. Survival and atrocity are bound together, inseparable, in the very fibers of human identity. Modern societies wrestle with this truth. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan remains a national hero, his face carved into mountains, his name on currency. But the genetic evidence tells a darker story that cannot be erased by monuments. His legacy is one of both pride and horror, of empire and violation, of unity forged from domination. The greatest empire of the steppes dissolved long ago, but its shadow remains. It lingers not in castles or chronicles, but in chromosomes. The empire may have vanished, but its inheritance continues to breathe in millions of living bodies. A reminder that conquest does not end with death, but endures in blood. In an empire where women were reduced to numbers on scrolls and shadows in torchlight, one woman transformed despair into defiance. Her name was Gerbal. To the Mongols, she was a concubine, one among thousands. To history, she became a whisper of vengeance that outlived kings. Gerbal had endured what countless captives endured, submission disguised as survival. Day after day, she bore the weight of humiliation, forced to serve the man who embodied the violence of an entire empire. Yet beneath her silence, she hid a fire. She came from a family that had once taught its daughters to wield blades in secret, a tradition meant to preserve dignity even in the face of tyranny. Her weapon was as small as it was unlikely, a hairpin of jade and steel, sharpened with patient precision. Worn as ornament, it passed unnoticed through the guards' inspections. To others it was decoration. To her, it was freedom waiting for its moment. That moment came on a storm-swept night. Thunder rolled across the steppe as the Khan summoned her. Inside the yurt, the air was heavy with incense and arrogance. As he reached for her with the certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable, Gerbal's hand moved with quiet resolve. She drew the hidden blade from her hair and struck with the force of generations silenced before her. The Khan collapsed in agony. His scream, sharp and ragged, was swallowed by the storm outside. Blood stained the silks of his chamber. Servants rushed in, guards shouted, but it was too late. The unthinkable had happened. The master of thousands had been brought down by the hand of one. The official record would deny it. Scribes wrote of illness, of noble wounds, of accidents on horseback. Witnesses were silenced. The empire could not allow the truth, that its feared ruler had fallen to a captive woman. Yet rumors could not be caged. The story spread across camps and villages, carried in whispers and secret songs. For Mongol commanders, the tale was poison. Every woman's glance became suspicious, every smile a potential trap. Some grew paranoid, killing captives out of fear. Others abandoned the practice of keeping concubines altogether. The shadow of Gerbal's defiance haunted their nights. Among women, her name became a prayer. Mothers whispered it to daughters, not as myth but as warning and inspiration. That even in the darkest chains, resistance was possible. Secret shrines appeared where offerings were left for her spirit. The Mongols destroyed them when they could, but memory proved stronger than fire. Gerbal did not topple an empire, but she cracked its illusion of invulnerability. With a single hidden blade, she reminded the world that no tyrant is beyond reach. Her act turned despair into legend, and her name, spoken softly in the dark, became the embodiment of vengeance and courage. The Mongol Empire did not collapse in a single blow. It expanded, fractured, and transformed. Yet even as its banners spread across continents, the machinery of sexual domination began to weaken. What Temujin had forged out of personal shame and turned into state policy could not remain eternal. Fear, paranoia, and whispered legends reshaped the practices of his successors. After the death of the great Khan, the story of Gerbal lingered in the shadows of every camp. Her defiance haunted the empire's leaders. Some Mongol Khans and generals grew cautious, unwilling to keep women solely for themselves. They began to share them in groups, believing that distributing both the pleasures and the dangers would dilute the risk of betrayal. Intimacy, once flaunted as a privilege of power, was now treated with suspicion. Gradually, the massive infrastructure of military brothels lost its central place. The fortresses of exploitation still existed, but with less fervor, less discipline. What had once been regulated by scribes and guarded with military precision faded into more conventional forms of slavery. Captives still suffered, but the grand design of conquest through the womb dissolved. The machinery slowed, not from mercy, but from the simple truth that brutality has diminishing returns. And yet, the scars did not vanish. The empire's cruelty had left indelible marks not only on individuals but on entire civilizations. In the genetic record, the Mongols remained, written into the blood of millions who never chose such ancestry. In architecture, homes in many regions still bore secret chambers and hidden alcoves built to conceal women during raids. In marriage customs, the urgency of early unions lingered, long after the threat had passed. Even in psychology, nations remembered. Beauty was cursed, vulnerability was dangerous, survival required sacrifice. For the Mongols themselves, the legend of their empire became a paradox. Statues and songs celebrated Genghis Khan as a lawgiver, unifier, and military genius, while the shadows of his policies were buried in silence. The official memory honored the empire's glory. The hidden memory carried its wounds. Across Asia, mothers still whispered caution to daughters. Families preserved rituals shaped by fear. In every scar, in every genealogy, in every hidden chamber, the empire lived on. Not in banners or armies, but in the quiet echoes of trauma passed from generation to generation. The Mongol Empire fragmented, its grandeur fading into history. Yet memory proved stronger than conquest. Even as the machinery of domination broke apart, its ghosts endured. The wounds it carved into human bloodlines, into architecture, into culture, and into the fragile trust between men and women could never truly heal. The empire had faded, but its scars remained eternal. In the heart of Ulaanbaatar, towering above the modern city, stands a gleaming statue of Genghis Khan. His face gazes sternly across the horizon, frozen in steel and silver, an eternal reminder of the empire he carved with blood and fire. His image is stamped proudly on Mongolia's currency, etched into monuments, and celebrated in festivals. To his people, he is not merely a conqueror, but a father of the nation, a genius of warfare, and a lawgiver who bound tribes into one formidable power. Yet behind this monumental pride lies a silence, an unspoken wound. The Mongols embrace his victories on the battlefield, but turn away from the darker truths of his rule. Few speak openly of the empire of forced marriages, of the countless women carried away in chains, or of the systematic turning of human lives into an engine of conquest. This silence is not ignorance. It is choice. To honor him is to forget the shadows. But history is not so easily silenced. Archaeologists uncover the remnants of fortified camps where women were once confined. Geneticists trace the startling legacy in bloodlines that stretch from the steppes of Mongolia to the coasts of Europe. 16 million men alive today carry the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan and his close kin. It is not myth, it is biology. His empire was not only measured in territory but in flesh, stamped into the very DNA of humanity. Even in folk memory, whispers remain. Songs and stories passed quietly in rural villages speak of women who vanished, of mothers who scarred their daughters to make them less desirable, of brides given away too young in hopes of protection. These echoes form a shadow history, one that coexists with the grandeur of military genius. Thus, the legacy of Genghis Khan is a paradox. He was both the builder and the destroyer, the unifier and the violator. His legal codes shaped governance, his military strategies reshaped empires, and his name became synonymous with unstoppable power. Yet at the same time, he stands as the most undeniable example in history of how lust and violence can be transformed into a weapon of genocide. To admire him is to wrestle with contradiction. To condemn him is to acknowledge the darker side of humanity's past. And perhaps that is why his legacy endures, because in Genghis Khan, humanity sees both its highest capacity for order and its lowest descent into cruelty, bound together forever in the same name, the same blood, the same memory.